Hey guys, tonight we slip off our shoes, wriggle our toes and step right into the heart of a medieval night, where the only thing colder than your breath in the air is the water sloshing around your ankles. You're the miller, or at least you play the part, and as dusk rolls into a humid, misty midnight, your little riverside mill is already grumbling to life. The wheel outside creaks as the water from the stream pushes it round, dripping, shuddering, its rhythm more reliable than any rooster's crow. Inside the walls sweat and the timbers groan. You listen the low drone of grinding stones, the steady drip of water down the window panes, a rat somewhere in the grain room rehearsing its tap dance routine for the third time tonight. You meanwhile have to start your shift barefoot because even the best boots lose the fight against wet floorboards by midnight. And no, there's no employee locker room. Just a shelf with a slightly less damp spare tunic and a wooden bowl of cold porridge. Outside, the moon is a thin silver coin that barely lights your path, but inside, the soft flowery dust in the air glows faintly in whatever candlelight you can spare. If you're wondering, yes, this is absolutely a fire hazard. Medieval safety tip. Don't sneeze too hard, or you'll be rebuilding the place from scratch. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're still awake, post your location and your local time below. It's always a good time for a midnight miller's tour. Right now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge to the heavy mill door, which, as always, needs a hip bump to open. Even though the wheel turns outside, everything inside feels still except for the water, which always finds a way to soak your socks. Flour sacks slouch against the walls, their seams dusty and splitting. You try to guess which ones will spring a leak before dawn. But the real gamble is whether the rats will get there first. It's one of the small pleasures of your job, playing spot the chewed sack before breakfast. Some nights like this one, the air feels heavy and expectant. You hear distant frogs, an owl, the far-off bark of a farm dog that probably wishes it was asleep in front of a hearth. But your hearth is cold, and your company is, well, mostly yourself. And a temperamental wheel that could in theory throw a spoke at your head if you annoy it enough. Fact of the night. Did you know that medieval mills were often required by law to run at all hours, even in foul weather? Lords and villagers depended on a steady supply of flour, and mills were the industrial engines of their day. But here's the quirky part. Millers were often accused of cheating. Some said they kept a miller's thumb, able to judge weight and quality by touch, alone a handy skill when you're paid in grain and suspicion. Historians still argue whether these stereotypes were fair or just convenient scapegoating from hungry neighbors who didn't want to pay the toll. You set to work lighting a stub of tallow candle, watching the flame flicker as flour dust dances around it. The candle is short, so you balance it atop a mound of pebbles in a little saucer. Anything to keep the wax from pooling on your only ledgers. You start to sweep the stones, the endless circles of grinding that turn wheat into the powder that becomes bread. The sound is almost hypnotic, the slow crunching of grain under stone. Your arms ache already, and the night's barely begun. But as you wipe your brow, you pause and listen, a ripple in the water, the subtle sigh of the river through its channel. You remember last week when old Tom claimed he saw a ghostly figure wading across the shallows at midnight, white as flour, silent as fog. Did it happen? Historians still debate the reliability of eyewitness accounts when they come from millers after 2 mugs of ale. You shrug, shake your head, and decide to focus on the real dangers: rats in the rafters, holes in your boots, and the endless damp that seeps into your bones. And if you're thinking I'd never survive a single night in a medieval mill, well, you're probably right. But for now, you keep grinding on. You glance at the stubby candle, and wonder if tonight you'll finish before it gutters out dripping hot wax onto the ledger again. Your hands are already dusted with flour and grit as you kneel beside the great grinding stones, the heart and headache of the whole operation. Grinding by candlelight isn't exactly romantic. It's mostly squinting, coughing, and trying not to trip over anything alive or dead. Still, the stones must turn. You tug at the wooden lever, feeling the familiar resistance, and listen as the grind begins a sound like distant thunder muffled by centuries-old beams. You've always been told that every respectable miller counts their toes in the dark. After all, you never know what you'll stub against a sack of stray stone, or if you're especially unlucky, the tail end of a rat who's not in the mood for small talk. As you move around, the ancient floorboards shift and creak beneath your bare feet. There's something honest about it, the way every sound and splinter tells you exactly where you are and where you probably shouldn't step. The night air presses against the little window, warping the candle's flame and casting long, wobbly shadows across the walls. Sometimes when the river fog is thick, those shadows look like figures moving just out of sight. Historians still argue whether these ghosts were tricks of the light, flower-induced hallucinations, or simply exhausted millers letting their imaginations run wild. You aren't sure, but you keep glancing at the door, just in case tonight's the night you meet the ghost of a grain merchant who swears you owe him 2 sacks and a favor. The grinding stones need your constant attention. Every now and then you sprinkle water to keep them cool, or scoop away bits of chaff that might clog the mechanism. Mainstream history tells us these stones could weigh more than a cart horse carved from local rock and turned day and night by river wind or muscle. What most people forget is how quickly they could chip or crack, and how a tiny flaw might ruin a week's worth of work. Between loads, you lean your head against the wall, letting the vibration rattle through your bones. It's oddly soothing. In the quiet, you listen for the scrape of claws, the tick-tick of tiny feet, your not-so-loyal co-workers scurrying off with stray kernels. It's a nightly dance, miller versus rat, and most nights, you're not entirely sure who's winning. You catch yourself yawning and force your eyes open. Fatigue is always your shadow. Even the busiest medieval millers had to battle sleep, especially on nights when the wind dropped and the wheel slowed. Some tried singing to stay awake. Others chewed on raw garlic, which, fun fact, was supposed to ward off both sleep and evil spirits. You tried it once. Now your breath is legendary, and you're pretty sure the rats avoid you on principle. The mill hums with the steady rhythm of work, but you can never relax entirely. Every so often you reach for the heavy sack of grain, hoisting it onto your shoulder, feeling your spine protest. Sometimes you wish for a second set of hands. But as you dump the grain into the hopper, you recall the old joke. If you want something done right, do it yourself, and then check twice for missing toes. You pause, glance out the window, and catch a glimpse of moonlight sliding over the river. There's a peace to it, even as the world grinds on behind you. You take a deep breath, cough on flour dust, and smile a little. This isn't the life most folks dream of, but it's yours, and you know the secrets that come with it, like how to tell if a sack is short by a handful, or how to patch a leak with nothing but a bit of waxed cloth and wishful thinking. You check your toes just to be sure, all present and accounted for, though you'd trade half of them for a dry pair of socks. You laugh at the thought, imagining future historians arguing over the importance of sock preservation in medieval industries. With another load ground and another candle inching closer to the end, you move deeper into the shadows, ready for whatever the next hour brings. Be it more rats, a surprise guest, or just another pile of grain begging to become tomorrow's bread. The hour deepens. The grinding rhythm softens to background noise, steady enough to lull you, but you don't dare drift. There's work to do, and the sacks of flour aren't going to move themselves. The mill's shadows are thick as stew, and your world narrows to the circle of candlelight, the swish of grain, and the whisper of sackcloth against your hands. You bend heft and haul another sack, your shoulders twinging as you swing it into place. These sacks are heavier than some of the complaints the townsfolk hurl at you, though not by much. Tonight you keep one ear cocked for the scuttle of rats. These are not timid field mice, they're bold, plump, and almost certainly plotting a midnight uprising. Medieval records claim millers could lose as much as 10% of their grain to rodents, though some historians still argue whether that's a rat exaggeration or simply poor bookkeeping, or, let's be honest, a little of both. Either way, you don't plan to let them win tonight's round. You pause at the storeroom door holding your breath. You nudge it open with your foot and there sure enough are two beady eyes reflecting the candlelight. You sigh. Another rat as expected. You tap the wall and it vanishes with a squeak. Later you'll set another crude trap, just a bowl of stick and some crumb bait. But for now the sacks must be checked for holes. The trick is to pinch the bottom corners feeling for soft leaks or the suspicious tickle of tiny feet. You'd like to say you're a rat whisperer, but really you just know where to look. But it's not just the rats you watch for. Sometimes, especially when the night's quiet, you hear something heavier, a step on the stones outside, or a low voice cursing your name. Millers have never been the village favorites. You handle people's daily bread, which means you handle their suspicions too. They think you skim off the top, sneak a little extra for yourself, or cheat the scales when no one's looking. Some millers probably do, though you'd never say so aloud. Tonight you half expect old Widow Grent to appear at your door waving her empty flour sack and muttering about lost ounces. You joke to yourself that she can weigh the truth better than you weigh the flour. One mainstream historical fact to keep in mind. In many parts of medieval Europe, millers were among the few villagers who handled coin regularly. They collected tolls, measured out shares for the lord, the church, and themselves. Quirky tidbit millers sometimes wore tiny purses tied to their belts, almost like medieval fanny packs, to keep toll coins separate from personal ones. There are woodcuts showing millers with so many pouches they look like lumpy hedgehogs. Historians still debate how much of the miller's reputation was deserved, and how much was just resentment. Bread was life after all. If your flour was short, your family went hungry. And who stood between the fields and the oven? The miller. Is it any wonder you keep glancing over your shoulder? Tonight you carry on brushing off the sacks, stacking them neatly by the back wall. Each one is marked with a different family's sign. Chalked X's, twisted knots of string, or just a scrap of colored cloth. If you mix up the orders, you'll have mothers at your door before dawn, each one convinced you're plotting to starve her children. The mill is a web of obligations, promises, grudges, whispered deals, and the occasional bribe of fresh eggs or a smoked fish. And of course, the ever-present threat of being caught skimming just a little too much. As you move another sack, you spot a small pile of spilled flour, a delicate white fan against the shadowy floor. You stoop to brush it away, knowing full well that every handful is precious, and that tomorrow someone will still claim they're missing a cup. You think not for the first time that being a miller is mostly about keeping your head down, and your account's just confusing enough that no one can prove anything. You listen to the water turning the wheel, the muffled grind, and the distant scolding hoot of an owl. You could swear you hear voices in the night just for a moment, then nothing. Maybe it's only the echo of your own doubts. You smile a little crookedly and return to your work. Midnight passes, but the grind never stops. You stretch your back, dusting flour off your hands, and turn to another of your many midnight duties, collecting the toll. Every sack of grain you grind belongs to someone, but a little bit always belongs to you, or more accurately, to your lord, the local priest, the king, and then if there's anything left to you. The miller's toll is as old as the mill itself, a slice taken from every load to pay for the privilege of having your grain ground. Sometimes it feels less like a business arrangement and more like a running joke with the universe, especially when folks arrive with sacks they swear have already been measured. You eye the ledgers on the rough-hewn table. Even in the flickering candlelight, you can see last week's scrawled numbers and little marks. Your personal code for watched closely pays late or prone to shouting at rats. You run your finger down the list, finding tonight's customers. Each entry is a quiet story. The cobbler's wife who brings in Rye the blacksmith, who likes his flour extra coarse. The reeve who pretends not to notice the lumpy sacks he delivers at odd hours. You always wonder if he's truly forgetful, or just very creative with his taxes. With a sigh, you hoist the toll chest, a battered wooden box with a lock that's more symbolic than secure. You tip in a portion from each new sack, eyeballing the measure, then glance over your shoulder. The official rule is 1/16 of every batch, but you're fairly certain no one in the village actually agrees what a 16th looks like. Historians still argue whether millers were systematically dishonest or just exceptionally good at improvising with scoops. A knock at the door breaks your concentration. You flinch, nearly dropping the toll chest onto your own toes. It's nothing, just the latch settling, or possibly the wind rattling the wood. But you can't shake the feeling of being watched even as you carefully tuck away the coins and grain you're owed. The local legend says the devil himself keeps an eye on millers, making sure they never get too greedy. You wonder if the devil would settle for a cup of flour and half a rat. You lean against the wall, counting and recounting the toll, running the numbers in your head. You try to be fair, but fairness, you've noticed, is a moving target, especially after midnight. The villagers grumble the Lord demands his share, and you're the one caught in the middle. There's a reason old stories call millers the most hated men in town. You sigh, recalling the ballads where millers are always clever, always suspect, and never quite trusted. Your favorite is the one where a miller outwits a witch by trading her a sack of flour filled with nothing but air. It's a classic, and you're not convinced it's entirely fiction. Tonight, though, you wonder who's really getting the better deal: the miller with aching arms and suspicious neighbors, or the villagers who sleep soundly as you count every grain. You catch yourself humming a tune just to break the silence, but stop when you hear another odd sound. A low groan, almost like a voice. Maybe it's the wind. Maybe it's your conscience reminding you not to sneak an extra scoop. For a moment, you think about all the other millers night after night, counting and measuring, always under watchful eyes, real or imagined. You realize you're part of an ancient tradition, one where the rules are always shifting and the scales never quite balance. And as you close the toll chest with a soft thud, you can't help but smile. At least you haven't been caught yet. You set the battered toll chest aside, rolling your sore shoulders and eyeing the massive grinding stones at the center of your universe. Every miller knows that the stones need constant care. Ignore them for a single night and you could lose the lot: stones cracked, flour ruined, and perhaps worst of all, a lord at your door demanding compensation you absolutely don't have. Tonight, the air tastes of grit and damp wool. As you crouch beside the stones, your candle stub flickering dangerously close to extinction. With a practiced hand, you pry away the wooden cover and squint into the gloom. The stones are ancient, carved from local granite, and worn smooth in some places, jagged in others. You can see the faint spiral grooves that help grind the grain, still sharp after years of use. But you also spot the telltale shavings and flour dust clinging in the corners, threatening to clog the whole affair. So, you fetch your little wire brush and a scoop, kneeling in the shadows as you clean away the debris. It's a job best done at midnight when the mill is quiet, and you can pretend for a few minutes that you're the only person awake in the world. Medieval records claim that stones needed regular dressing, a process of sharpening, regrooving, and evening out the surface with a special chisel called a mill bill. Mainstream historical fact: these tasks were dangerous, requiring the stones to be lifted and braced, sometimes with nothing more than a wooden lever and a few prayers. And here's the quirky bit. Millers had their own secret symbols carved into the stone's surfaces, little marks meant to bring luck or ward off bad spirits. You run your fingers over one such mark, a crude spiral, hoping it's still working. You wedge the stones apart and poke your brush between them, the scratch of metal echoing in the cavernous space. If you listen carefully, you can hear water moving under the floorboards, the heart of the mill churning on as you scrape and clear. Your fingers go numb, but you keep working. Historians still argue whether medieval millers were as skilled as the sources suggest, or just really good at covering up mistakes when the flour came out lumpy. You pause to wipe your brow, catching sight of your reflection in the dark polished stone. You look like a ghost yourself, flour in your hair, shadows under your eyes. You remember a story, one you heard as a child, about a miller who tried to fix his stones alone and ended up trapped for hours, the villagers finding him at dawn, still muttering about goblins. You smirk. You've had your fair share of midnight mishaps, though nothing quite so dramatic. Just a bruised shin here, a squashed thumb there, and the endless, relentless grind. Tonight, the stones groan as you check their alignment. You pull a wedge, test the balance, and mutter a few words you'd never say in front of the priest. The truth is, most of the work is just stubbornness and a willingness to get your hands dirty, literally and figuratively. You wonder if future generations will ever understand just how much flour dust a person can inhale in a lifetime. Suddenly, the brush snags on something and you freeze. Could it be a lost coin or a pebble from someone's muddy boots? You tease out a tiny button, wooden, likely from a tunic cuff. You chuckle softly, imagining how many stories are ground into these stones, how many secrets and lost treasures hide in the flour. You finish up sliding the stones back into place and giving them a gentle tap for luck. You know you'll need it. There's always one more thing to fix, one more risk to take. But for now, the grinding resumes smooth and steady, and you allow yourself a moment of satisfaction. It's not a glamorous life, but it's yours. And as you stand brushing dust from your knees, you promise yourself you'll tell no one about the button. Let the scholars argue over how careful millers really were. Tonight you survived another round. You straighten up from the grinding stones, stretching until your back pops, and wander over to the narrow window to check on the river. The moon floats above the black water, reflecting in ripples, and for a moment you lose yourself in the quiet. Most nights you'd say the only company a miller keeps is the wheel, the rats, and maybe the cat. But then you remember the old stories, the ones whispered while the stones spin and the candles burn low. River ghosts, drowned millers, shivering shapes glimpsed at the edge of sight. Every mill on a lonely bank has a legend, and yours is no exception. Supposedly the river remembers every body it claims, and more than one miller has stumbled on a moonless night, only to vanish beneath the water. You tell yourself you don't believe it, but every time the wheel gives a groan or the current changes course, you shiver just a bit. You prop open the back door, letting the river's chill drift inside. The water wheel's heavy paddles dip and rise, slapping the surface with a regular thunk that echoes through the beams. Somewhere out on the far bank, a frog croaks a single note. You remember the odd superstitious things you do without thinking, like tossing a pinch of flour into the river at the start of every shift. They say it keeps the ghosts satisfied, though you mostly just like watching it swirl away. Mainstream historical fact superstitions ran deep among medieval tradesfolk, especially millers. Whether it was because of the ever-present danger or the lonely hours, no one can say, but charms and rituals flourished in the dust and gloom. You lean against the doorframe, eyes heavy, thinking about old Nan's tale from the village. She swears she saw a drowned miller walk the bank dripping riverweed, asking for his lost sack of rye. Historians still argue whether these stories were warnings, entertainments, or desperate explanations for all the missing flour and missing men. You decide you don't want to find out firsthand. Back inside, you check the corners for any signs of trouble. Shadows pool under the rafters, and you half expect to see a pale face peering back. Instead, it's just a rat bold as brass helping itself to a stray crumb. You wave it off and smile. At least rats can be reasoned with sometimes. Ghosts are another matter entirely. Quirky tidbits: some millers tied tiny bells to the wheel, or hung sprigs of rowan above the doors to keep the spirits away. You glance at your own charm, a knotted bit of red string, and give it a tug for luck. Better safe than sorry, you mutter, not that you'd ever admit to believing in such things if pressed in daylight. A gust of wind rattles the shutters, and you almost drop your candle. You shake your head, grinning at your own jumpiness. This is what comes of too many hours alone, too many ghost stories told by candlelight. But you make a mental note to toss an extra pinch of flour into the river next time, just in case. As you settle back into your routine, grinding, hauling, checking the gears, you keep one ear tuned for that telltale splash, that drifting voice, the warning signs of midnight mischief. Because whether it's ghosts, rats, or just the regular perils of the job, you know that no 2 nights in the mill are ever exactly the same. The stones rumble, the water flows, and the mill stands sentinel beside its restless river. You sigh, grateful that for now the only thing haunting your night is the mountain of flour left to grind. You let the door swing shut and rub your arms, feeling the river's chill fade as you return to the grind. The night wears on, and with it comes the shuffling business of secret deliveries, a task best performed when honest folk are sound asleep. Not every sack of flour goes straight from mill to baker's oven, and you, like most medieval millers, sometimes make a little extra on the side. You check the back corner where a bundle waits, its string tied in a knot only you and your most trusted customer would recognize. There's an art to clandestine trading. Sometimes it's a bit of fine flour, sometimes just a handful of sifted bran for the village brewer. You tuck your cloak tighter, feeling a thrill of mischief. There's a strange pride in being the midnight middleman, even if you know it could land you in trouble. Mainstream history records that black market bred illegal trading outside the Lord's share was both common and risky. Millers, so often painted as sly and slippery, sometimes greased their own palms along with the mill's gears. But here's a quirky tidbit: in some regions, millers kept a false bottom in a grain bin, hiding the best flour for special clients or for emergencies. You glance at your own bins and smirk. Let the scholars keep arguing whether the secret trades were widespread or simply village gossip. Tonight your secret is safe. The door opens quietly. It's your partner for this little escapade, a wiry baker's apprentice with quick eyes and a nervous smile. No words are needed. You nod past the bundle and accept a wedge of hard cheese in return. Cheese and flour, the midnight currency of survival. As your apprentice vanishes into the night, you can't help but wonder if you've made another friend, or simply added a new link to the chain of people who know too much. You return to your ledgers, noting the exchange in a code only you understand: 2 dots, a swirl, a line. Historians still argue over how organized these secret networks really were. Some claim whole villages thrived on the miller's quiet trade, while others insist it was just a handful of clever souls dodging taxes. Your heart pounds, though, not from guilt. It's the thrill of the forbidden, the knowledge that in the shadows you wield a quiet kind of power. You try not to let it go to your head. After all, for every secret deal struck, there's a risk: a neighbor's curious glance, a guard's surprise visit, a lord's unexpected audit. As you slip the cheese into your bag, you recall another odd tradition. Millers in some towns would bless their black market flour with a whispered charm, convinced it would make the bread rise higher and the risks fall away. You give your own sack a hopeful pat, more out of habit than belief. Maybe there's something to the old superstitions, maybe not. You move back to the main room, candle nearly spent, and let yourself relax for a minute. The illicit exchange is done for now, and the world hasn't ended. You lean against the cool stone, chewing the edge of your reward, and listen to the steady grinding of the wheel, reminding you that come morning the business of bread must go on, secrets and all. You wipe a bit of cheese from your chin, feeling oddly triumphant, and return to your place by the grinding stones. With the secret delivery out of the way, you finally have a moment to puzzle over something that's been gnawing at you all week. The grain is running low, lower than it ought to be. You eye the sacks stacked by the far wall, mentally counting them for the 5th time tonight, wishing you trusted your own arithmetic more. Even the mill cat seems to notice the tension slinking around your ankles, as if to remind you of every last kernel that's gone missing. There's always gossip in the village about shortages. Some blame bad harvests, others whisper about greedy lords hoarding the best wheat for themselves or distant wars disrupting the usual trade routes. Mainstream historical fact: famines were a constant medieval threat, and a miller's fortune could rise or fall on the rumor of a failed crop in a neighboring shire. The lord's men come around with their tallies, eager for taxes and explanations. But it's you who faces the villagers at dawn, their faces pinched and anxious when the flour sacks run thin. Quirky tidbit: some mills kept emergency flour, a secret stash buried in barrels beneath the floorboards to be doled out on lean days or sold for 10 times the usual price when desperate times hit. You look at your own floor, half wishing you had the foresight and the extra grain to pull off a trick like that. Historians still argue whether most millers were the quiet heroes of hungry villages, sneaking flour to starving families, or just savvy opportunists with a nose for profit. You run your hand over the ledgers again, checking for signs of theft or error. But the numbers don't lie. The grain is vanishing. You sigh and scan the rafters. Maybe it's the rats more brazen than usual. Or maybe one of your helpers is helping themselves a little too eagerly. You remember the look in young Tom's eyes last week, when you left him alone with the rye sacks, guilty, nervous, and far too interested in the cat for someone who supposedly hates animals. Outside, the river murmurs, and a breeze flutters the candle's flame. You lean back, letting your head thump softly against the wall, letting the mill's ancient heartbeat throb through your bones. Another sack arrives tomorrow. Or so the rumor goes. But who knows how much will be left after the lords share the priest's tax, and the ceaseless hunger of mice and men alike. You rise, determined to check the rest of the building. You stoop to peer under benches and behind barrels, half expecting to find a secret tunnel dug by desperate villagers. No such luck, just a heap of dusty cobwebs, and an old wooden shoe forgotten by someone too tired to remember where they left it. As you dust off your hands, you remind yourself that despite all the worries and shortfalls, the mill is still turning. And as long as you can keep it running, even with a little creative accounting here and there, there's hope for another day's bread. You cast one last glance at the dwindling sacks, resolve hardening. Whatever's causing the shortage, you'll figure it out. Or at least find a new excuse before the reeve comes calling. Until then, you grind on with the quiet confidence that millers have survived worse than this. You pause by the flour sacks, rubbing your gritty eyes, and listen for the telltale shuffles and whispers that seem to haunt every mill. Gossip is the true currency here, almost as important as the toll grain or a loaf of slightly stale bread. It travels through the cracks in the walls, rides the backs of apprentices, and lingers on every sack you move. You can't help but eavesdrop after all. A good miller is part detective, part confessor, and always a suspect. Tonight's rumor mill is especially lively. Some say old Matty was seen sneaking around the grain stores after dusk, looking shifty and mumbling to himself. Others insist the vicar's nephew is siphoning off flour for his charity baking, which, if true, is the most pious kind of larceny you can imagine. You chuckle, knowing every crumb tells a story, and most stories are half true at best. Still, you take the gossip seriously enough to double-check your stores. You run your hands along the seams of the flour sacks, feeling for soft patches or the faintest leak. You scan the floor for the trail of powder that always betrays a thief, or sometimes a particularly determined mouse. It's a nightly ritual. Investigate suspect, clear the cat's name again, and hope no one's clever enough to outwit you. Mainstream historical fact. Medieval millers were required by law in many places to swear oaths of honesty right there in front of the whole village. You remember your own swearing in, the crowd's suspicious stares, the awkward silence, and the Reeve's voice booming about the sacred trust of the mill. You managed not to laugh, but just barely. The irony, of course, is that nearly everyone expects a miller to cheat, and yet you're the one held to the highest standard. Historians still argue whether this constant scrutiny made millers more honest, or just more inventive at covering their tracks. Tonight, as you check the ledgers, you can't shake a little doubt. What if someone's been skimming flour under your nose? Or for that matter, what if you accidentally shortchanged a customer? You try to remember if you counted right at sunset. The numbers blur together, and suddenly, it feels possible that you're the culprit, unintentional perhaps, but a thief all the same. You roll your eyes at your own anxiety. Maybe you should start keeping track of your own thoughts, just as carefully as the toll grain. You spot young Tom shuffling past, whistling a suspiciously tuneless tune, his hands behind his back. You call out, but he vanishes around the corner with only the mill cat as his alibi. The cat naturally looks offended. You decide you're too tired to chase either of them and return to the business of suspicion. Quirky tidbit: in some villages, millers would sprinkle flour over their ledgers and storehouse doors to catch thieves by their footprints. You think about trying it just for fun, but suspect you'd catch yourself more than anyone else. Still, the image of you tiptoeing through your own flour trap makes you snort with laughter. You close the ledgers, stack the sacks neatly, and sit on your favorite crate for a minute, listening to the ever-present grind. If there's a thief among you, man, mouse, or ghost, you'll catch them eventually. Until then, you'll keep your eyes open, your scoops honest mostly, and your sense of humor intact. For in the end, every miller walks a fine line between suspicion and survival, and tonight is no exception. The grindstone hums on as you settle onto your haunches for a rare moment of rest, only to feel a familiar nudge against your ankle. The mill cat prowling with all the confidence of a creature who believes it owns the place. You watch it begin its nightly patrol, slinking between sacks, leaping effortlessly onto beams, eyes glinting with a strange intelligence. In a world where everyone suspects the miller, at least the cat is reliably suspicious of everyone else. You follow your furry companion through the shadowy maze, noting the places it lingers: a pile of spilled grain, a gap under the door, a cluster of cobwebs in the corner, where the fattest rats like to hide. Cats and mills go together like bread and butter, though it's not just about rodent control. There's an old saying, a miller without a cat is courting disaster. Mainstream historical fact: many medieval mills kept at least one cat on the payroll, so to speak, as an essential part of the operation. In some villages, the cat's comfort was even written into the miller's contract: one bowl of milk and a corner by the hearth. Tonight, you watch your cat pause, ears swiveling, then pounce at a scuttling blur. Success: one less rat to nibble the grain. You offer a sleepy cheer and scratch its head, earning a brief grudging purr. But beyond the practical, cats are wrapped in layers of lore. Quirky tidbit: mill cats were thought to be lucky, but only if they chose you. The wrong cat could curse your mill for years at least, according to old wives and a few anxious millers. You recall the story of the mill across the river where the cat disappeared and the millstone cracked the very next day. Coincidence? Historians still argue whether the rise of mill cat magic was genuine belief or simply a clever way to ensure someone fed the Mauser. Your own cat has been with you for several seasons, and you're convinced it understands the whole operation better than most apprentices. You talk to it sometimes during the slowest hours. After all, a cat can't repeat your secrets or accuse you of skimming off the top. Well, unless you count the way it stares at you when you sneak a heel of bread from the toll chest. The cat winds its way up to the window ledge, tail flicking, and you watch as it scans the darkness outside, as if expecting some rival feline to attempt a midnight raid. You've seen it chase off everything from rats to wayward pigeons, and once a nervous apprentice trying to filch a crumbly cheese. If only all your problems could be solved with a quick swipe of the paw. You remember another odd bit of lore some millers swore by keeping a pinch of flour on the cat's back for good luck or tying a bit of red ribbon around its neck to ward off witches and thieves alike. You eye the mill cat's current ribbon fraying but still bright and resolve to replace it tomorrow. After all, you could use all the luck you can get. The cat eventually curls up on a warm sack and closes its eyes content in its kingdom. You smile reassured by its presence. Historians may never agree on the true power of the mill cat, but in your nightly world, it's a steady companion, a quiet guardian against gnawing teeth, creeping shadows, and perhaps even the lingering suspicions that cling to every sack. For now, you leave it to its dreams and return to your rounds feeling just a little more hopeful. After all, in a miller's life, you take your comforts where you can, especially if they purr. You slip back into the heart of the mill, the grindstones hum, a constant companion, and the steady slap of the water wheel, a sort of sleepy metronome in the night. Of all the chores you face, there's one you can never quite escape: maintaining that lumbering water wheel. It's the real master here. Without it, the mill is just a damp, oversized barn, with far too many rats and not enough bread. The wheel's deep groan always makes you a little uneasy. Tonight you fetch the bucket of grease and the battered mallet, mentally preparing yourself for another round of repairs. You step out into the night, the river's chill brushing against your skin, and crouch beside the creaking paddles. You run your hand along the ancient wood slick with moss and river slime, searching for signs of splinters or rot. Mainstream historical fact: water wheels required constant upkeep, as even a small crack could grow into a disaster. One good snap, and the whole village might lose its bread for a week. You prod a swollen board with your finger and frown. There's always something. Sometimes you dream of a wheel that never breaks, but that's about as likely as a miller never being accused of cheating. You wedge your shoulder under a loose axle, bracing it while you thump a stubborn peg back into place. Quirky tidbits: some millers stuffed the cracks with sheep's wool soaked in tallow, believing it kept out both leaks and evil spirits. You don't know about spirits, but the trick certainly stops a few drips. Your breath fogs in the night air as you check the ropes and wooden cogs, hoping not to find anything worse than a squeaky gear. And there's always the risk: slip just once and you're in the river, soaked, shivering, and likely the subject of mockery at every tavern for a month. Historians still argue whether most millers did these repairs themselves or hired wheelwrights for the dirtiest jobs. You suspect the answer, as always, is both. The brave did it themselves, the rich hired help, and the unlucky just learned to swim. A gust of wind rattles the reeds along the bank, making you jump and nearly lose your grip. You chuckle to yourself, remembering the old joke: what's wetter than a miller's boots? A careless miller's breeches. You double-check the braces and test the paddles, giving each a firm push until you're sure it'll last until morning. By the time you're done, your hands are sticky with grease and your tunic is spattered with mud. You can't help but smile, though a working wheel means another day's work, another sunrise, another loaf of bread in the village oven. You head back inside, stopping to wash your hands in a bucket by the door, the water freezing cold and shockingly bracing. You pat yourself down, count your toes, a habit that never gets old, and whisper a quick thanks to whatever saint watches over exhausted millers. With the wheel turning strong and true, you feel just a bit lighter. You know more troubles will come. Another storm, another crack, another wild rumor in the tavern. But for tonight you've outwitted the river once again. The grind resumes steady as your heartbeat, and you return to the warm dust and the soft shuffle of the mill cat, ready for whatever else the night may bring. Back inside, you wipe your muddy hands on the least dirty corner of your tunic and let yourself sag against the wall for a breath. The wheel outside rumbles on, but it's the noises inside the mill that keep you sharp. The rhythmic clack of wooden gears, the sigh of wind leaking through ill-fitted shutters, and an occasional unplaceable creak that never seems to have a source. There's always something groaning in the beams. Sometimes it's the wood, sometimes it's you. Tonight, though, the mill feels particularly alive. Every floorboard seems to whisper a secret. You move through the gloom candle flickering and the shadows dance along the flower-coated walls. Historians still argue whether medieval mills were truly haunted, or if a hard day's work and a lack of sleep simply made millers see things that weren't there. Either way, you wouldn't be the first to jump at a sudden noise, nor the last to swear you saw a figure vanish around a corner just out of sight. You grin to yourself recalling that time your apprentice dropped a pot and convinced himself the mill ghost was out to get him. For a week he slept with a handful of grain under his pillow, because apparently that's what keeps a mill ghost sated. Quirky tidbit: in some regions, millers left offerings of flour or bread near the main beam, just in case something or someone was watching over the grinding. It never hurts to keep your options open. The night deepens. The usual chorus of creaks and groans grows bolder, each sound a test of your nerves. Somewhere in the rafters, something scuttles. You tell yourself it's just another rat, but the part of your mind trained by decades of whispered stories wonders if it's something else. You remember the tale of the mill, 2 villages over abandoned after 3 millers in a row claimed to see the White Lady drift between the stones at midnight. Mainstream historical fact: many rural mills developed reputations for hauntings, and some were even avoided by the bravest souls after sunset. You pause at the main beam, running your fingers over the old wood, feeling its warmth beneath the cool surface. You murmur a few soft words of thanks, half blessing, half habit, then tuck a crumb of bread into a little knot in the wood just for luck. You'd never admit it in daylight, but tonight in the hush, it feels like the right thing to do. You return to your rounds, listening as the wind hisses through the shutters and a low moan rises from the gears. You shake your head, smile wryly, and remind yourself that the only real ghosts are unpaid debts and missing flour sacks. Still, you keep one eye on the shadows and one hand on your trusty broom just in case. The grind goes on, and you, a little dustier and a little more superstitious than before, go with it, half watching, half dreaming, waiting for dawn and the reassuring racket of village life to drown out the mill's midnight secrets. You take a slow breath, letting the floury air fill your lungs as you tackle a truly unpredictable part of your midnight shift. Odd jobs for odd hours. There's never just one thing to do at a mill, and if you ever thought otherwise, tonight's list would set you straight. You check your pocket, pulling out a crumpled scrap patch. The flour shoots stir the soaking barley, and your favorite grind, a bundle of herbs that the village healer swore would keep the spirits out and the bowels moving. You start with the barley, moving to a corner where a wooden tub sits half filled with water and sweet-smelling grain. It's for the local brewer who trusts your hands more than his own apprentices. Mainstream historical fact: many medieval mills did far more than just grind wheat. They helped malt barley for beer, crush seeds for oil, and even process dyes or clay for village crafts. Millers wore many hats, most of them flour-dusted and slightly askew. The herbs come next. You open the little cloth bundle and sneeze as a puff of thyme sage and something suspiciously bitter rises up. You load it into a smaller stone grinder, the apothecary's mill as you call it, and set the stones spinning. The aroma fills the mill, pushing back the usual smell of damp and dust. You can't help but smile. Quirky tidbit: in some places, millers even ground pigment for artists, their floors spattered with splashes of ochre or blue. You spot a faded green stain near the stairs, a remnant from last summer's dye job for the Weavers' Festival. Historians still argue whether all these side jobs were legal, or if most were simply tolerated, so long as the Lord got his share? You suspect the answer is, it depends on the mood of the bailiff, the need of the villagers, and how convincingly you could smile while handing over a pot of honey on the side. While the herbs grind, you patch a split in the flower shoot with a strip of waxed cloth and a few muttered words. It's not elegant, but you learned long ago that perfection is overrated. The real art is in making things work just well enough to last until next week's disaster. You remember the time you tried to fix a leak with a lump of bread dough effective for 5 minutes, delicious for the mice, and absolutely useless after that. Your tasks pile up as the hours slip by. You sweep the steps, fetch water for the donkey, and check on a sack of broad beans promised to the village cook. Sometimes the line between miller handyman and general night watchman blurs entirely. You hear a distant thump and pause, wondering if it's the wind, a prowler, or just your overworked imagination. Either way, you clutch your broom like a sword and march bravely into the shadows, only to find your apprentice Tom trying to sneak an extra heel of bread. You let him off with a warning and a joke, reminding him that if he ever wants to take over the mill, he'd better learn to patch a flower shoot without eating half the inventory. Tom grins mouthful and disappears back into the shadows, leaving you with the odd comfort of knowing someone else will remember these midnight rituals long after you're gone. You return to the grind, the scent of herbs, mixing with the persistent dust, and tick another chore off your endless list. It's not glamorous and it's rarely easy, but there's a satisfaction in mastering a dozen odd jobs no one else in the village would touch after sunset. By now your body aches in all the usual places. Shoulders back, even your eyelids feel heavy. The rhythm of the grindstone, the hiss of flour in the chute, and the low ticking of the old wall clock nudge you toward that strange in-between state medieval folk called first sleep. It's the kind of drowsiness that comes in waves, cresting and breaking as you lean against a flour sack, staring at nothing in particular, just listening to the sounds of a mill that never truly sleeps. If you had a choice, you'd curl up beside the mill cat and call it a night. But duty is duty. And besides, no one expects a miller to keep a sensible schedule. Mainstream historical fact: most medieval people slept in 2 shifts. First sleep after dusk, then a wakeful hour or two, then second sleep before dawn. Millers' hours, though, are famously irregular. Sometimes you sleep standing up, broom in hand, dreaming of a life where your biggest worry is whose turn it is to fetch water. You blink awake and move to check the stores again, poking at the dwindling piles of grain, making a mental note to order more if the harvest comes through. You envy the villagers who snore in warm beds while you wander in this flowery twilight. But you also feel a strange pride in your strange hours. After all, who else is trusted to keep the bread coming night after night? The oddest part of these broken nights are the dreams that slip in around the edges. Half-formed visions of flooded rivers, stacks of gold coins, and once, very vividly, a parade of mice in tiny aprons demanding higher wages. Quirky tidbit sleep deprivation was so common among millers that some even invented lullabies for the grindstone, singing nonsense verses to keep themselves company, or to try and trick their bodies into thinking they were resting. You hum a few bars of your own song, half mockery, half tradition, letting the soft sound blend with the rumble of the stones. Historians still argue whether medieval sleep was really so different from ours, or if the tales of segmented sleep are just a product of wishful thinking, perhaps an attempt to explain away all those half-remembered dreams and midnight superstitions. You shrug, feeling the fatigue pull at your limbs, but you know your job is far from done. You pace the mill, yawning and stretching, trying to keep yourself alert. You toss the cat a crumb of cheese and watch as it bats it around, utterly unbothered by the hour. You stop to listen for the quiet footsteps of your apprentice, making sure he hasn't snuck off for a nap. No such luck. He's perched on a sack, eyes drooping, barely awake, but still pretending to be useful. You give him a gentle nudge and send him off to check the door latches, mostly to keep him moving. As the world outside the windows grows even darker, you embrace the odd rhythm of the miller's night. In this between time, neither fully awake nor fully asleep, you do your best work. You catch errors you missed earlier, notice small leaks, and remember to turn the wheel that adjusts the grain flow just in time to keep everything running smoothly. You may not have the luxury of first sleep and second sleep like the rest of the village, but you have the steady, soothing grind of the stones and the comfort of knowing that come dawn bread will rise because of your midnight hours. The hush of the hour is broken by a sound you dread, a sharp, frustrated voice from outside the mill door. You sigh, bracing yourself. Toll disputes never respect the clock. Even at this impossible hour, someone will insist you've cheated them out of a handful of flour, or that your scales are as crooked as a politician's promise. You crack open the door to find a pair of peasants glaring at you, sacks slung over their shoulders, faces pinched by cold and suspicion. One waves a finger, the other clutches his grain like a miser guarding his last coin. They speak at once, voices tripping over each other. Shorted us again. That sack was heavier before last week's batch was nothing but dust. You hold up your hands, inviting them inside. If you're going to argue about fractions of a pound, you'd rather do it near the warmth of the grinding stones. Inside, they drop their sacks with thuds that echo through the mill. You keep your voice steady, gentle, even a bit drowsy. There's no point in matching their fire. You walk them through your process, showing the marked lines on your measure, the weights that theoretically are certified by the local reeve. Mainstream historical fact: medieval millers were often required to use official measures and could be fined or worse for light bread or short-weighted sacks. Of course, no matter what you show, suspicion lingers. One peasant insists his sack was fuller last season. The other whispers about millers' tricks and old curses. You almost admire their persistence. Quirky tidbit: some medieval villagers swore that a miller's hands were slick as an eel's, able to palm a handful of flour with no one the wiser. You look down at your own flour-caked palms, wondering if you should take it as a compliment or an insult. Historians still argue whether these nightly disputes were about real losses or simply the anxiety of hungry people living too close to the edge. You suspect it's both. Bread is survival, and a short sack could mean skipped meals for a family. You weigh the sacks, scoop the flour, and narrate every step, half for their benefit and half to remind yourself you're doing things right, at least tonight. Eventually, your calm wins out. Or maybe fatigue does. The peasants accept your explanations, though not without a few more pointed grumbles and a warning that the whole village is watching. You almost laugh. You know they are. You escort them back to the door, their anger cooled by your patience and the thickening night. As they disappear into the dark, you lean on the doorframe, exhaling deeply. These disputes wear you down, but they're part of the job as much as patching a chute or cleaning the stones. For all their bluster, you know they'll be back next week, ready to argue about a different batch. You close the door and check the sacks one last time, your mind replaying the exchange. You remind yourself that trust in a miller is always provisional, earned in ounces, lost in grains. You pat the mill cat, who has watched the whole thing from its perch, eyes half closed, looking like the only truly impartial judge in the village. With the night quiet again, you return to your rounds, grateful for a few more hours of peaceful grinding. Before dawn brings another round of negotiations, and inevitably, another tale for the village to debate. You barely have time to settle back into the hum of the mill before the heavy knock of authority raps at your door. You freeze mid-step, knowing that cadence too well. The Lord's steward, or worse, the Lord himself, has come calling. You run a quick hand through your hairbrush flour off your tunic and try to look less like someone who's been up to their elbows in grease dust and suspicion all night. The door swings open with a chill gust, revealing a tall figure in a dark cloak, lantern raised. Behind him stands the reeve, smirking, slightly ledger under one arm. You swallow. The steward's eyes sweep the mill, taking in the sacks, the flickering candle, the drowsy apprentice blinking in the corner. Evening, you manage voice as calm as you can muster. To what do I owe inspection? The steward cuts in, striding past you without waiting for an invitation. The reeve follows, already scribbling notes. You feel your stomach knot. Mainstream historical fact: medieval lords often sent inspectors, sometimes without warning, to ensure millers weren't skimming toll or hiding grain. A good inspection could mean a pat on the back. A bad one could end with a fine or worse. You trail them as they poke through the sacks, measure grain tapstones, lift the lids of barrels you thought you'd hidden well. You offer polite explanations, knowing from experience that protest only raises suspicions further. You catch Tom trying to stifle a yawn and nudge him sharply. The last thing you need is an apprentice snoring in front of the Lord's men. Looks light. The reeve mutters, eyeing one sack. You open it with exaggerated care, sifting the flour with your bare hands, showing the fine consistency, the weight. Quirky tidbit: some inspectors carried their own measuring cups, convinced every miller in Christendom was plotting to cheat them by an ounce or two. Historians still argue whether these inspections were truly about justice, or just another way for lords to tighten their grip on local economies. You suspect it's both. And tonight, as the steward stalks through your mill, poking the cat's tail with his boot, and muttering about filthy creatures, you keep your face blank and your voice steady. They question you on everything: how much grain came in yesterday, where the herbs were ground, what you gave to the brewer, even why you look so tired. You want to laugh: why wouldn't you look tired at this hour? But you only smile faintly, showing them your records, the scales, the worn ledgers you guard like treasure. Finally, the steward snaps the ledger shut, giving you a hard look. See that it stays honest, he warns before turning on his heel and disappearing into the night, the reeve close behind. You close the door and sag against it, letting out a long breath you didn't know you'd been holding. The cat rubs against your leg as if to say you survived another round. You whisper a thanks into the gloom to the saints, the stones, and anyone else who might be listening. Tonight you pass the test. Tomorrow you'll sweep the floors again, patch the sacks, and hope they don't come knocking quite so soon. The door clicks shut behind the steward and reeve, and you let out a shaky laugh, part relief, part exhaustion. But there's no rest yet. The grindstone rumbles on, and so do the demands of the night. You light another candle and drift back toward the center of the mill, where the air is thick with flour dust, and the old beams creak under their own weight. Tonight, you pause by the small shrine tucked into a corner near the gear, housing a battered wooden icon of Saint Honoré, patron saint of bakers and millers. You light a stubby taper and whisper a quick prayer, more habit than faith. Still, there's comfort in the ritual. Mainstream historical fact: medieval mills often contained small religious shrines or charms to protect against bad luck accidents, or the lurking fear of spiritual corruption that came with handling others' daily bread. You trace the little carving with your thumb, remembering old Nan's stories of mills cursed by jealous rivals, stones that cracked for no reason, or loaves that refused to rise because the miller had skipped his nightly prayers. Historians still argue whether these tales were genuine belief or simply a way to explain away the relentless unpredictability of machinery, weather, and human greed. You suspect it was both. The candle's warm glow seems to steady your pulse. Outside, the wheel creaks on the steady slap of water, a kind of hymn. You murmur thanks for surviving the inspection, for surviving another night, really. The cat brushes past your legs, perhaps sensing the moment's hush, or perhaps just hoping you'll toss it another crumb of cheese. You take this moment of quiet to sweep flour from around the shrine and adjust the worn cloth hanging over it. In the background, Tom snores softly from his perch on a flour sack. You shake your head. He's young, And he'll learn that there's never really sleep in this business, only long blinks between crises. Quirky tidbit: some millers kept sprigs of yarrow or blessed chalk over the grindstones, marking protective symbols to keep them turning smoothly. You glance at the faint cross you chalked last month, barely visible now under layers of flour dust. You make a mental note to redraw it tomorrow just in case. Your shoulders slump as the weight of the night returns. There's always another sack to move, another ledger to check, another whisper in the dark about curses or theft or divine punishment. And yet beneath it all, there's the steady heartbeat of the stones grinding grain into the powder that feeds the whole village. You sigh, straighten, and pick up your broom again. If the saints want to help, let them, but for now, you have work to do. The grind never stops, and neither can you. You set the broom aside and head toward the mill's small storeroom, where a rickety table holds 2 mugs, a cracked plate, and the remains of a midnight snack: hard cheese, half a loaf, and a scattering of crumbs. Your partner is already there, hunched over the table, grumbling under her breath as she scribbles notes on a scrap of parchment. She glances up, eyes tired but sharp, and gestures for you to sit. You slide onto the bench, easing sore muscles, and let out a long sigh. She hands you a mug filled with weak ale that's gone lukewarm. Still think you're the hero of the village, she teases, nodding toward the ledgers piled beside her. You snort. If I'm the hero, we're all doomed. You share a quiet moment, sipping and picking at crumbs. Outside, the wheel rumbles, the stones grind on, and the cat wanders in, tail flicking with mild disdain. Your partner rolls her eyes at the cat, then fixes you with a weary look. They were complaining again today, said the flowers thin, that the toll's too high, that you're skimming off the top. You shrug, fighting the flicker of annoyance. Mainstream historical fact: millers and their families were often targets of rumor and resentment. Handling the village's food supply made you both essential and despised. Historians still argue whether most millers were truly greedy or simply easy scapegoats for every empty belly in town. She leans closer, voice low. Maybe you should let the reeve check the stones himself next time. Show them there's nothing to hide. You shake your head and let him poke around the bins, the tools, the extras. You glance meaningfully at the flour stash you've kept hidden to trade for herbs and extra cheese. She smirks. Fair point. A sudden gust rattles the shutters. She jumps slightly, then glares at the window as though daring it to try again. You joke about it being the ghost old Nan swears lives in the mill, the one who steals flour and sings lullabies to the grindstone. Quirky tidbit. Some villagers believed ghosts of past millers lingered, ensuring the new miller never grew too comfortable or too dishonest. You both fall silent for a while, chewing, listening to the wind, the wheel, the faint rustle of mice in the walls. She breaks it first, muttering about the unfairness of it all, how the Lord always wants more, how the villagers grumble, how no one understands what it's like to be up all night, defending every grain, every crumb, every scrap of your own reputation. You rest your hand over hers, the warmth of it grounding you in the midst of this endless grind. We're still here, you say softly. We're still feeding them. They can curse us all they want, but come sunrise they'll be back. She smiles, tired but genuine. The cat jumps up on the table, stealing the last crumb, and you both laugh, even if it's the sort of laugh that edges on tears. Then, with a sigh, you stand. The grind never stops, the wheel never sleeps, and neither, it seems, do you. You leave the storeroom behind, stepping back into the main mill chamber, just as a distant rumble of thunder echoes through the rafters. Great. As if the night hasn't tested you enough already, now the weather wants to join in. You glance at the window. Rain hammers the panes, streaking them with muddy rivulets. The river, which moments ago murmured softly beneath the wheel, now roars with a dangerous urgency. Your stomach knots. Floods are the miller's nightmare, water that turns from friend to enemy in the blink of an eye, swelling the river until it swallows wheelstones and every carefully stacked sack of grain. You rush outside, cloak pulled tight, boots sinking into mud as you race around to the back where the wheel churns wildly. You squint through the downpour, checking the paddle braces, praying they hold. Mainstream historical fact: medieval mills were especially vulnerable to flooding. Some millers built makeshift channels or dug trenches to divert overflow, but these were often crude, temporary solutions. Historians still argue whether mills truly improved river control or simply shifted disaster downstream. You shout for Tom, who appears a moment later, hair plastered to his forehead, eyes wide with panic. Together you haul sacks off the floor and onto higher platforms, your breath ragged in the cold night air. Water creeps beneath the doors, pooling around your ankles, soaking through your boots. You said we'd patch the lower walls next week, Tom yells over the roar. You grit your teeth. Plans change. You both scramble to move barrels, push boards against the door cracks, anything to slow the river's hungry advance. The cat perches on a high beam tail, flicking, watching your frantic ballet with casual indifference. Quirky tidbit: some medieval millers believed the river was alive, a spirit to be placated with offerings of bread or coins. You mutter a few curses that sound suspiciously like prayers, promising the river whatever it wants if it spares the wheel tonight. You check the main gear housing, running your hand over the slick wood. So far it holds. The wheel groans under the pressure, but it turns, your heartbeat echoing its rhythm. You glance at Tom, who's panting, soaked, his face pale. You give him a quick shove toward the stairs. Stay ready to run if the wall gives you growl, even though you both know there's nowhere else to go. Historians still argue whether millers were heroes for keeping the bread flowing during disasters, or simply the last fools to leave a sinking ship. You figure maybe you're both. Finally, the rain slows. The water stops rising, and you slump against a barrel, soaked, shivering but breathing. The wheel keeps turning, and the stones grind on as if mocking your terror. You let out a ragged laugh, half relief, half madness, and pat the nearest beam like an old friend. The grind never stops, you whisper, and neither do you. The rain finally eases into a steady drizzle, and you and Tom collapse onto flour sacks, panting, clothes dripping. The water still laps around the edges of the floorboards, but the worst has passed for now. You take a moment to catch your breath, feeling every bruise and blister you've earned tonight, and then you push yourself up again. There's one more job before dawn, counting the day's profits, tallying the toll, and sorting out what little might be left for yourself. You pull the battered ledger from its shelf and run your finger down the smudged columns of numbers. Every sack you've ground tonight has its mark here: a weight, a family name, a tiny sign indicating how much toll you took. You weigh out the grain owed to the Lord, the share for the reeve, and finally the handfuls that make up your own pay. Mainstream historical fact: most medieval millers earned their keep through toll rights, keeping a small fraction of every sack of grain they milled. It was steady work, but often left them open to accusations of greed. As you measure, you can't help but recall the old stories of millers who got rich building fine houses on the hill, their tables piled high with bread and roast meats, while the villagers starved. Historians still argue whether these tales were exaggerations. Some surely were, but you know of at least one miller hanged for skimming off more than his share. You run your hand through the pile of grain, weighing it against the hunger that waits in your own cupboard at home. Tom watches you silently, eyes darting between the toll chest and the sacks. You toss him a small bundle. "For your family," you say. And he blinks surprised, then nods gratefully. Quirky tidbit: in some villages, millers were known to hide their share under false floorboards, or even in hollowed-out beams, just in case the Lord's men arrived demanding more. You glance at the old trapdoor under your table where you've tucked away your own meager emergency stash. You make the final entries in your ledger, careful and deliberate. Even if the villagers complain, even if the reeve glares at you, these records are your defense, your proof that you took no more than your due. Whether they believe you or not is another matter entirely. As the wheel rumbles on, you let your mind wander for a moment, picturing the legendary millers you've heard about, those who supposedly turned flour into fortunes, dodged every reeve's inspection, and died peacefully in featherbeds rich and feared. You smile faintly. You doubt you'll join their ranks. But you also know you'll do whatever it takes to keep the stones turning, to keep the bread flowing, to keep the wheel from falling silent. You close the ledger with a soft thud, set the weights back on the shelf, and stretch your sore shoulders. Dawn creeps closer, the sky outside softening from black to dull gray. The grind goes on, the wheel creaks, and your night's work rolls into another day's burden. You glance toward the door as Tom finally drifts off to sleep, head slumping onto a sack. You almost envy him, but there's no time to rest. You pick up the old broom and pace the floor, sweeping flour into neat piles, mind drifting, as the grindstone hums on. The worst of the night has passed, but another job waits, keeping watch for prowlers, and for things far stranger than thieves. You think back to every story you've heard about millers alone at midnight, about shadows that creep along the walls, voices whispering from the water wheel, and pale figures lingering in doorways. Mainstream historical fact: many mills were believed to be haunted places where the border between life and death grew thin under moonlight and moving water. Tonight, the wind howls outside, rattling the shutters, and you swear you hear someone calling your name. You freeze, broom held tight, straining to listen. But there's only the creak of the mill, the steady churn of the wheel, and Tom's soft snores. Still, your skin prickles. You make your way toward the door, peer into the darkness beyond, but see nothing but rain-soaked earth and the faint glint of moonlight on the river. Quirky tidbit: some millers swore by telling ghost stories to apprentices as a way of training them, breaking them of fear through repeated sleepless nights, filled with rattling chains and whispered curses. You return to your stool, shaking your head at your own jumpiness. Historians still argue whether these ghost tales were tools to keep apprentices awake or genuine fears passed down through generations. Either way, you catch yourself muttering charms under your breath, old nonsense rhymes meant to ward off trouble. After a while, you pull Tom awake, hand him the broom, and set him to sweeping while you light another candle and sit by the wall. You share ghost stories in low voices, half serious, half to keep yourselves awake. You tell him about the White Lady of the River, the phantom miller who wanders with empty sacks, the spirit cat that steals a little flour from every pile. Tom laughs nervously, but his eyes keep darting to the shadows. You can't blame him. The longer the night, the more the mind invents monsters. But you also know that real trouble wears a human face more often than not: an angry villager, a greedy reeve, or a rival miller ready to sabotage your wheel. You keep watch, broom in hand, eyes on the door, ears tuned to every creak and sigh of the old building. Whatever comes, ghost or man or rat, you'll face it the same way you face everything here, tired, cautious, and determined to keep the grindstone turning until dawn. You rub your eyes, pushing back the bleariness that clings to every blink, and turn your attention to the gears. There's a low clunking. You don't like a dull thunk with every third rotation of the wheel. You set the broom aside, motioning for Tom to keep watch, and crouch beside the gear housing, candle held close, shadows flickering over oiled wood and old iron pins. You prod at the gears with the tip of a stick, watching the teeth turn. There it is again. A skip, a groan, a shudder you feel in your bones. Mainstream historical fact: medieval mills depended on a delicate balance of wood, iron, and river force. A single broken peg could stop the stones, and some repairs took days of heavy labor and precise carpentry to fix. You run your fingers along the rim of the big drive wheel, feeling for splinters or loose pieces. The candle flame trembles as you mutter a soft curse. You spot the problem: One of the big oak pins is cracked. The wood split just enough to knock the whole gear out of true. You sit back on your heels thinking fast. Historians still argue whether millers really had the skill to maintain these complex machines, or if they leaned on itinerant craftsmen millwrights who traveled from village to village. In your case, you've learned enough to patch things well enough to keep grinding. You grab your toolkit, little more than a hammer, a wedge, and a handful of pegs, and get to work. Tom hovers nearby, wide-eyed. "Shouldn't we stop the wheel?" he whispers. You shake your head. "If we stop now, we'll never start it again before the river slows." Quirky tidbit: some old millers swore the wheel had a spirit of its own, and that stopping it at night invited bad luck. You don't exactly believe that, but you're not about to risk it either. You work by touch and instinct, wedging in a fresh pin where the cracked one threatens to split further, tightening the housing with a few carefully placed blows. The gear still wobbles, but the worst of the knock fades. The wheel grumbles, but it keeps turning, the grindstone settling back into its steady hum. You lean against the frame, wiping sweat from your brow, and sigh in relief. "That'll hold till sunrise," you mutter, hoping you're right. Tom nods silently, clearly impressed, though you spot the fear still lurking in his eyes. "You'll learn," you tell him, half kindly, half wearily. "This place always needs something. A cracked gear, a loose stone, a leak, a rat. The mill never sleeps, and neither do we, not really." He manages a shaky smile. Outside, the first pale hint of dawn lightens the sky. You close the gear housing, blow out the candle, and pat the wall for luck. For now the wheel turns, the stones grind, and you've wrestled the machinery into temporary obedience. But you know there will always be another crack, another break, another sleepless night when everything threatens to fall apart again. You sigh, stretch your sore arms, and look out the window at the pale river, steady and silent. The grind never stops. The faint glow of dawn trickles through the cracks in the shutters, but the night isn't quite over. You return to the storeroom, rummaging for something to eat, your stomach growling louder than the grindstone. You find a heel of bread, stale but serviceable, and a small jug of ale you'd hidden behind a sack last week. Your own little reward for surviving another endless shift. You settle onto an overturned bucket, savoring the first bite of bread, the faint tang of yeast and salt lingering on your tongue. Tom joins you, clutching his own hunk of bread, and together you chew in sleepy silence, the grinding stones rattling on in the background like an old lullaby. Mainstream historical fact: millers often set aside flour for themselves, trading it with villagers for fresh bread, ale, or bits of cheese. In some places it was almost an unofficial currency, a barter economy humming along beneath the watchful eye of the Lord and his men. Historians still argue whether this was a fair perk or outright theft. Millers as always walked that thin line between necessity and suspicion. You raise your mug in a half-hearted toast, muttering to surviving the night. Tom grins sleepily, clinking his mug against yours. "And to not falling in the river," he adds, which draws a snort of laughter from you both. Quirky tidbit: there were old superstitions that sharing bread and ale before sunrise would keep misfortune away for the rest of the day. You decide it can't hurt. You tear off a small piece of your bread, tossing it into the corner where the mill cat lurks, eyes gleaming in the dim light. The cat pounces on the crumb tail, twitching with satisfaction. "Lucky charm," you murmur, and Tom nods solemnly, as though the ritual might truly hold back the tide of broken gears, angry villagers, and unexpected floods. Outside, the river mumbles on softer now, as the rain-swollen current begins to ease. The wheel turns slow and steady, like an old horse trudging home. You lean back against the wall, savoring the brief peace of a midnight feast, even if it's closer to dawn. Historians still debate how much time millers truly had for themselves, whether they were the secret kings of the village economy, or simply worn-down workhorses grinding out a living one sack at a time. You know the truth lies somewhere in the middle. You get your moments, a mug of ale, a bite of bread, a fleeting laugh, and then the grindstone calls you back again and again. You finish your bread, drain your mug, and set both aside. Enough resting, you say, your voice rough but resolute. The morning's coming and they'll be banging on the door soon enough. Tom nods, wiping crumbs from his chin, and rises with you. You stretch, roll your shoulders, and glance around the mill. For now, everything is running. The wheel turns. The stones grind. And there's still a little bread left for the next break, assuming the cat doesn't steal it first. The faint gray of dawn grows brighter by the minute, casting long, pale beams through the shutter cracks. You move around the mill, cleaning what you can before the morning rush. The wheel grumbles along, wet and creaking, while Tom sweeps up stray flour and tries not to fall asleep on his broom. You check the seams of the sacks, patching one with a strip of waxed cloth, then tidy the ledgers, placing them in the battered chest you keep locked beneath your stool. The grindstone hums steadily, but you listen closely for changes in the pitch. Any sign of trouble that might mean more work before the village starts lining up outside. Outside, you hear the first voices, faint shouts from across the river. Farmers calling to one another, carts rattling on muddy roads. Mainstream historical fact. The mill was often the first place awake in any medieval village, a beacon of steady labor that signaled the day's beginning for everyone else. You think about how many mornings have started just like this: stiff joints, gritty eyes, and the knowledge that the grind never stops. Tom comes over with a worried look. "Wheels groaning again," he says, glancing nervously at the door as though expecting the reeve to barge in at any second. You nod, wiping your hands on your apron. "It'll hold," you murmur, half to reassure him, half to reassure yourself. Quirky tidbit: in some towns, villagers brought offerings, cakes, eggs, or even flowers to the mill at dawn, hoping for blessings on their baking or harvests. You've seen a few old women leave scraps of bread on the step, muttering prayers as they walk away. Historians still debate whether this was superstition or just village courtesy, but you've learned to accept the gifts without comment. You push open the shutters, letting the weak morning light spill across the grinding floor. The dust glows in the soft rays, floating like motes of gold. Outside, you spot the first figure trudging up the path with a sack on his back, a regular face, grim eyes sunken from worry over the harvest. You brace yourself, brush flour from your hair, and paste on the tired but polite smile you've perfected over countless dawns. "Ready?" you whisper to Tom, who nods silently, broom gripped like a shield. The mill cat flicks its tail and slinks toward the door, ready for another day of stolen crumbs and soft naps. You envy it more than you care to admit. The morning crowd will bring questions, demands, arguments over weight and toll, rumors of war, famine, or the latest marriage scandal in the village. But right now, in the few breaths before the first knock rattles the door, there is peace, a quiet moment in which you hear nothing but the creak of the wheel and the soft rustle of flour settling into the bins. You savor it. Then you stand, stretch, and face the door. Whatever comes, you're ready. The first knock rattles the door low and hesitant, as though the caller dreads the toll as much as the grind itself. You glance at Tom, nod once, and pull open the door to greet the line of villagers that's already formed outside. They're half awake, shoulders hunched against the morning chill sacks slung over their backs. Their eyes flick over your shoulder to the rumbling grindstone, checking that the mill is still running, that their flour will be ready by nightfall. You usher them in, motioning to the space near the scales. They file past, quiet but watchful, each clutching their grain like a last precious secret. You weigh and mark each sack, your hands moving on autopilot, the same routine you've done 1,000 times. Mainstream historical fact: in many medieval villages, the miller was often the first and last person villagers saw each day, a necessary but never quite trusted gatekeeper of their daily bread, the first man in line. Old Matty grumbles that the rain spoiled half his harvest and that the Lord raised the tax again. You listen, nod, and offer a few soft words. Nothing you say will change his lot, but the ritual comforts you both. You scoop a measure into the toll bin, ignoring the way he watches every flick of your wrist. Historians still argue whether millers deserved their reputation as cheats, or if it was simply the cost of standing between hunger and the harvest. The grind goes on. The wheel outside groans under the strain, but you keep the stones fed, moving from sack to sack, customer to customer, voice low and even. Quirky tidbit: some villagers believed that a miller who whistled at dawn brought good luck to every loaf that day. You hum softly as you work an old tune your grandmother taught you, half lullaby, half ward against bad fortune. As the sun climbs higher, the line shortens, but your energy drains just as fast. Tom stumbles once with a sack, nearly dropping it, and you steady him with one hand, muttering, "Careful, one misstep, and we'll be cleaning flour off the floor till noon." He blushes and nods, eyes red from lack of sleep. You glance outside and see the pale blue sky brightening, the storm clouds of last night finally gone. The river runs high but calm, the wheel dripping steady rivulets back into the flow. For a moment, you let yourself breathe, feeling the weight of the night roll off your shoulders. The mill creaks, the cat yawns from its perch near the door, and you know you've survived another cycle. You pass the final sack back to its owner, offer a nod, and close the ledger with a soft thud. The rush is over for now. There will be more customers before dusk, more flour to measure, more small disputes to soothe. But for the moment, you let yourself sit on the stool by the window, eyes half closed, watching the river slide by. The grind never stops, and neither do you. But even a miller can rest just a little in the warm hush of late morning. The grindstone's hum softens, blending with the gentle rustle of the river outside. You let your shoulders slump, letting the day's ache seep into the wooden stool beneath you. The light through the window is soft and golden, now picking out drifting motes of flour that dance lazily in the warm air. Your breath slows as you watch them swirl, each tiny speck catching the sunlight before vanishing into the hush of the room. The wheel creaks gently, a comforting lullaby you've known longer than you can remember. In this quiet moment, you feel the weight of the night ease like an old cloak sliding from your shoulders. You close your eyes just for a moment and imagine the wheel slowing, the grindstone settling into silence, the river outside murmuring a soft song meant only for you. The warmth of the cat against your ankle is steady, its soft purrs a reminder that not every part of this life is burden and toil. You breathe in the scent of warm flour, old wood, and river mist. The villagers will return soon. Voices raised, sacks in hand, stories of taxes and rumors to trade. But for now, there is only the hush, the slow roll of the wheel, and the gentle hum of life continuing on, one breath, one heartbeat, one grain at a time. You let your eyes drift shut again, just for a moment longer, trusting the steady rumble of the stones to cradle you as the world outside brightens into day. The grind never stops, but here in the soft hush of morning, you let yourself believe just for a moment that all is well.